Hi, welcome to Sammy Joe's Books. I'm Sarah Marchman and I have my cup of Joe right here, and we discuss all things from horror to classic literature. Today we're going to be discussing the morality between the two characters, Henry V from, of course, Henry V, and Macbeth from, of course, Macbeth. How these two main characters came into their power and how that may have affected their outcome. Henry V was born of royalty. During this time, there was a thought of predestination. And if you were a rural, then your path would be fruitful. I want to read this quote. It's from Henry V, his advisor. From Act 1, Scene 1, line 10 through 12. Canterbury said, "The courses of his youth promise it not. The breath no sooner left his father's body," when his father died, "but that his wildness, mortified in him, seemed to die too," when he was hanging out in the bars. Yeah, at the very moment, consideration like an angel came, and whipped the offend out of him, Adam out of him, leaving his body a paradise. This is very interesting language that we will continue to recognize this theme. But whenever someone really talks about Henry, it's more of this like angelic approach. It's this like religious rhetoric that is very interesting to me, because I think it says a lot about how Shakespeare views roles. Now, going back to where Shakespeare's theater is placed, there's a lot of propaganda in the fact that Shakespeare's patrons are usually monarchs. So you see this theme without these two plays that Shakespeare has kind of a bias towards the monarchs. And by saying that his body is a paradise after his dad dies when he becomes king, I think this is a point to prove that Shakespeare really thinks of this predestination of these roles. Now, that compared to Macbeth's path to the crown, he is accounted with witches. This question that the witches pose of a murder that happens. Now, going back to the predestination, Macbeth, he was a subject, and to kill the king is treason. However, him and his wife, they think about it and they kill the king. This is a turning point in the play very early on, because I think this act of free will determines his fate. He decided to go against the king. He decided to kill the king, and now his path is infected. And this language of infectedness really comes to play in Macbeth. Because if the witches gave him two options, he could have easily turned away from the witches. He could have easily said no to the witches and not killed the king. Let's go back to this act of free will. When he committed treason, he said, "Is this dagger which I see before me the handle toward my hand?" He says this in the form of a question. Therefore, he had a choice. He goes on to say, "Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, and I see thee still. Art thou not fatal vision, sensible in feeling as to sight? Or art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation, proceeding from he oppressed brain?" Again, you have this illusion of a dagger, but then you have this actual dagger. You can choose to not have this, you could choose to have the illusion and not have the dagger. This is from Act 2, Scene 1. Going back to free will in Henry V, he has multiple choices. For example, Henry V has 3 thieves on his hands. He chooses to be merciful against them. He could have easily chosen to killing them, and he would have less of an impact than Macbeth killing his king. I also want to describe how King Henry, his language is different than Macbeth. And his loyalty is different than Macbeth's. Now, I think this all goes back to Henry V being merciful and Macbeth being a tyrant. From King Henry V, one of his subjects says, his subject is Bates, and it's in Act 4, Scene 1. Bates says, or more than we should seek after, for we know enough if we know where we are the king's subjects. If his cause be wrong, our obedience to the king wipes the crime out of it or of us. Now, this is interesting because when you think about it from a metaphorical type of view, it's more of like how there's a parallel between King Henry V, and there's multiple throughout the play, but right now there's a parallel between King Henry V and of Jesus. His subjects are very loyal to him, and if he dies for his reason, then they believe if they die, they will be repent of all their sins, like Jesus and his disciples. Comparing that to Macbeth, whenever Macbeth is talking about his fate, the witches, he always asks it in a question. He's always questioning his morality. He's always questioning his choice to be with the witches. One of these is in the scene where he is going into battle and he questions whether or not he should be in the witches. In Act 4, Scene 1, he is referring to the witches in this point. Infected be the air whereon they ride, and damned all those that trust them. I did hear the galloping of the horse, who wasn't came by. Now, infected is a really interesting word here because during this time, disease was rampant. And he is saying that wherever the witches go, it is infected. However, I want to point out that since he chose to be with the witches, he is also infected. And I think that comes from his predestined fate to not be king. There are a few visions that the witches show Macbeth. The witches, when he first kills the king, they show him a vision of Banquo and all of his line of descendants. And in this line of descendants, they have a cup to lead to the future. Now, of course, this is confusing to Macbeth because he's like, hey, just killed him. How is he going to have descendants? That's what leads him to hire the 3 murderers. This could be paralleled to the 3 thieves that I've talked about in Henry V. When Macbeth chooses to hire these 3 murderers, he chooses to make sure that they kill the king's descendants. He is not merciful to the king's descendants, and in turn, this leads them to the war. Whenever Macbeth's counterpart, whenever he has his language, it is always reference to a religious rhetoric, like in Henry V. For example, in Act 4, Scene 1, quote, "Some holy angel fly to the court of England and unfold his message ere he come, that swift blessings may soon return to our suffering country." This, compared to what Macbeth is saying about the witches and his language, is very interesting to me because I can draw a parallel between how Shakespeare talks of these roles to how he talks of his subjects. Since Macbeth is a descendant of the king, when he uses the words, "Some holy angel fly over the court of England," that is literally religious symbolism. And because he says some holy angel, there is very fact that he's referring to himself becoming king. This is an interesting choice by Shakespeare, because when he talks about these kings versus when he talks about Macbeth, it is a sort of propaganda for the church. Going back to where the theater is located on the Thames River, there are two monarchs that Shakespeare follows. In Henry V, Shakespeare is under Queen Elizabeth. That's why you get this play of Henry V. But I think comparing that to Macbeth, who is under King James, is an interesting theory, because you see a lot of King James propaganda in Macbeth. For example, with the scene when it comes to the cups, the glass cup that I talk about being towards the future, according to our lecture, that is the lineage of King James. He comes from Scotland. Again, Macbeth takes place in Scotland. Now, in demonology's main theme is to fight against witches. Now, witches are in Macbeth, of course, but there is a specific theme that King James reiterates again and again, and that is that witches prey on the weak morals of men. I think this is the main point of this discussion, is that Macbeth's morals were so weak that he was able to be preyed upon by the witches. Whereas King Henry, his morals were so strong that he was able to defeat France. Each of these quote-unquote kings had decisions that they had to make in order for their fate to be sealed. Now, King Henry, of course, made the right decisions. I think it's more interesting that Shakespeare chose King Henry to make all the right decisions and Macbeth to make the wrong decisions, because it shows when you go with the king, King Henry, versus against the king, Macbeth. This sort of propaganda is really, really fascinating to me, because it really does show who is Shakespeare appealing to. He's appealing to these rural subjects. He's appealing to the monarchs. This is how he's able to keep his company going. And so when we talk about audience, I think it's important to see how morality and how these themes relate to the history that was going on. Okay, that was a lot, but to wrap it all up, Shakespeare's main audience was the monarchs. And I think this shaped a lot of his plays, including Henry V and including Macbeth. You can see this from how they rose to their thrones and how Macbeth was a subject, but King Henry was of royal descent. You can see this in how their morality as characters are placed. King Henry is this more Jesus type figure, and Macbeth is this, rotten moral compass. And you can see it in the characters that he plays. So you have the witches, which is a reference to demonology. You have King Henry, which is a reference to Queen Elizabeth and her lineage. You can also see this in their fates. King Henry, of course, wins against France because he's a merciful king. And Macbeth dies because he is of pride and he falls to the witches. What do you think about these two plays? What is your thoughts on the audience that Shakespeare was trying to uphold? Do you believe in predestination? And lastly, leave a comment below on your favorite morally askewed character. All right, bye guys.